The chapter that we are studying now in the Life Divine, the evolution of the spiritual man, is describing how the spiritual consciousness in the mentalized human being emerges out of the mind and comes into its own and goes through stages of evolution. Exactly as the mind consciousness emerged out of the animal, first came into its own, and then developed itself to create a sophisticated and complex mental life. Exactly as life itself emerged out of matter, came into its own as a separate power, organizing itself, and then developed more and more complex parts and expressions of itself. So what we are seeing is only one more step in a progressive evolution. But this one more step we saw is not another step after which there is to be another. Because the spirit emerging is also the origin out of which mind came. And even as mind was the originator of the life energy, which was the originator of the material world. And so the involution by which the material world emerged, was created, is also the track along which the evolution now goes back and completes its journey with spirit. And this is extremely important to recognize, because as long as there were some intermediate steps, each intermediate step emerging brought a new capacity, but its power was intermediate. But when spirit is emerging, its power is not intermediate, its power is original. And therefore, when it emerges, what it reveals is far greater than what mind could create as emerging from life, or life could create as emerging from matter. Not only it's far greater, its power turning back on mind, on life, on matter, is also original, undiluted, not intermediate, but decisive and final in whatever it chooses to do. Unlike our mental experience, as we grow into mind awareness, as we develop our powers of intellect, we can turn back on our life instincts and say, I want to change this. I have a tendency to get angry or jealous, and I want to change this, and I start working on it, and it's difficult. I have to struggle, I have to insist, I have to persist, and then gradually something changes, and then if I let it go, it tends to slide back into its old habit, and I have to keep persisting. Because the power of mind over life is not complete. Mind is not free of life, it is still half bound and dependent on life. Even as it wants to override the body and say, well, why should I eat? Why should I sleep? I want to keep doing my work. It cannot. Because life itself is dependent on the body and on matter to such a degree that the body can say, okay, if you don't cooperate, I shut you down and you collapse. Mind has a limited power, but spirit emergent from mind, as it continues to come into its own, has all power, can actually turn upon mind and say, I will not be limited by this, nor by life, nor even by matter. And not only it can develop its own freedom utterly, but also impose its freedom and its free choice and reshape mind and life and body utterly. So this transition is of such great importance. It's not one more step of an old series. It is literally the beginning of a whole new possibility of the original power of creative power of the spirit revealing itself in a body which is living, in a mind which is conscious, and through which it can reveal as freely and as completely as it revealed itself in forming the universe. with the same power that creates the universe now available in a focal point of an individual mind, life, and body. What can it do? Rather, what can't it do? That's the point that we are at. In the discussions last time, Sri Aurobindo gave us some pretty detailed and compelling evidence to show you that although spirit emerges out of mind, it is not made of just another type of mental experience. You see, our mind has emerged in life, which has emerged in body. So it feels to our mind as if I am a product of my life and of my body. Even though at times we are able to separate in mind and feel free, the practical reality is we are dependent on the biology and the life energy, prana. And so it feels as if mind is only a special operation of the biology and life force. But always we discover that what is emergent was already present inside. You recall the example Sri Aurobindo gives us. It looks as if lightning emerges from the cloud and the water vapor. But if you go deeper, you find the electricity of lightning was always present inside. Because it was present, it could emerge. So in the same way, in the first emergence of the spiritual consciousness, it may feel as if it is only a special functioning, a higher functioning of the mind, but it is possible to emerge because it was already and always secretly working through the mind from behind. This is the discussion we had last time. And the emergence is something so important. What then is this emergence going to be like? And so he places before us two questions. The first question is, what is the nature of this spiritual reality or spiritual being that is to emerge? And second, what is the method and the process by which this spiritual emergence is going to take place out of mind? Now both questions are so critical because first, it is easy to confuse the spiritual with the mind or some refined experience of mind. So to distinguish them is important. And so as a first step in what we will read today, Sri Aurobindo will distinctly separate out and show you what that is like when it separates and comes into its own. Then subsequently, which will probably be the discussion in the next few sessions, we will see how and by what process and method this separation is going to take place. And recognizing this, we will be able to consciously participate in it, even assist in it, and thereby speed up that emergence of the spiritual consciousness that is already within us, waiting to come out. So first step, Sri Aurobindo writes, it is true again that it is difficult for man's mind to distinguish entirely the soul or self or any spiritual element in him from the mental and vital formation in which it makes its appearance. But that is only so long as the emergence is not complete. So, when the spiritual experience begins to happen, we cannot make out always where the mind finishes and where the spiritual comes. So, as you are standing on the top of a mountain, you look out and suddenly you feel a deep peace, a sense of a vastness, and it feels so real, so relaxing, so compelling that for a moment you even forget yourself. And then suddenly someone says something, or there is a sound, or your mind comes back and says, oh, what time is it? I have to get back. For a while you had as if lost your normal sense of I. And you'll say, oh, I must have been daydreaming. Oh, it was so peaceful, I felt so good. But you do not recognize that perhaps you touched something which is not just a refined or relaxed or wider condition of your mind. Because it feels as if it was your own mind that became relaxed and free and wide. But was it something different? You cannot be sure. Or you say, whenever I sit in my garden and look out and I forget everything else, I feel as if I'm connected with all the plants and all the animals or birds. Sometimes even it feels as if I'm just part of one big universe and maybe I'm never separate, or even I forget myself. There is only this beautiful universe. And again, it feels as if you are just broadened out in your emotional or sentimental or life energy experience, a oneness of the prana of life which fills everything. And perhaps not recognizing that there was a part of it which was fundamentally different. So it's difficult to make this distinction, but he says that is only so long as the emergence of the spiritual element is not complete. When it becomes complete, it becomes so distinct that you cannot make that error. He gives the example. In the animal, mind is not quite distinct from its own life matrix and life matter. Its movements are so involved in the life movements that it cannot detach from them, cannot stand separate and observe them. But in man, mind has become separate. So compare ourselves with the problem of any animal, even a pet animal, especially compare with animals that you know closely, and generally with dogs, one has that experience, or with cats. Anyone who has spent a little time with pets, you recognize immediately that they have an intelligence, they have a complex intelligence sometimes, but the intelligence is as if so tightly bound into their pattern of behavior, so tightly fixated on their instinctive drives of food, survival, fun, that you do not see it operating like in a child who says, "What's happening? Why is this?" It's only directed to, how can I manage that which I want? In fact, this is the case for quite a large part of humanity which is still living in a half animal consciousness. What do you use your intelligence for? How to make my life more comfortable, how to grab more to fulfill my desires, how to dominate or possess, or whatever the instinct is pushing you to do, how to make it more effective. There's a book called How to Make Friends and Influence People. And the whole objective of that book is, how can you get them to like you so that you can get out of them what you want? The whole orientation is for yourself. You could just as well have taken a step, and this is what you will see in some of the religions, where, as in the Buddhist practice of loving kindness, you just want to be kind and loving to the world or to all beings for the sake of it, not for what you get out of it. Of course, the first practitioner of the path will say, yes, I have to become more kind so that I will gain good karma, so that I will be a better monk or practitioner, or I will be a great teacher, or whatever his ambition is. So you try to be good so that you can fulfill again your personal desire. And so there are gradations with the mind coming into its own, where it begins to separate and recognize that I do not need to fulfill the instinctive drives and desires as my primary purpose. In fact, the mind, Sri Aurobindo points out, always, the intellect, as the primary power of mind, always needs to serve some objective. If you leave the intellect to itself and it starts rationalizing, lives for itself, very quickly it discovers it can justify anything, prove anything, chase after anything, and it will never be sure if it's the right thing. It becomes agnostic. It cannot know what is my purpose. So either it turns down to fulfill your impulses, desires, and pretty much animal instincts, or it turns up and tries to fulfill a higher ideal. But it cannot live for itself. It serves no purpose. So emerging from animal, you can see that it does not have the capacity to separate. I've shared an interesting experiment I did with a dog once, and it of course came for food. I had a piece of whatever it wanted, and I swung it to one end, the head turned. I swung it to the other, and its eyes were fixated on the food, licking his tongue. And at some point I kept going, It went left and right and left. And I said, how far will it go? I counted. 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. When I hit 12, I think around 10 or 12, suddenly the dog stopped. And my hand kept moving. It looked straight at me, into my eyes. Like that. And it was as if it was saying, what are you doing? The fixation of the instinct to latch on to the food and the salivation, all those operations had stopped. Suddenly it was the mind, and a conscious mind looking at me straight, and this question, surprise, puzzlement, but almost like a challenge, saying, what, why? It was fascinating because at that point the food had no effect on him. It was as if the mind, which was embedded in the instinctive life drives, had just stood up and now taken on its charge. This on a human baby would happen after 2 movements or one single movement. He stops and looks at you. Why are you playing with me? The difference between the dog and the human baby was only how many steps it took for the mind to step out. The same with an adult. The moment I hold what he wants, okay, now it's not a lollipop which I would use with a child, but the adult, maybe it's a little diamond or some precious object which is attractive to him. I move it back as he takes it. Instantly he stops and looks at you. Are you going to play a game with me? Instantly. But what happened? Till then he was driven by his instinct. The moment it went outside the domain of instinct, he didn't know how to manage. The mind picked up and separated itself. And after that, when I finally gave it back to the dog, it went back, but it was still confused because now it was not dog anymore. It was dog with intellect or power of mind separated out. It was a little disoriented. What is this new experience? And I suppose eventually the mind would have settled back into its embedded condition. But what if you trained it repeatedly to pull out that mind impulse? Very quickly you will have a behavior which will not be a normal dog. You will literally see it behave like an intelligent, semi-human mind. And this is what happens with many of the more advanced animals. Some of the big gorillas, some of the dolphins, even some of the bigger killer whales and so on, that they quickly come into a kind of a mental consciousness. And after that, you can have such a complex relationship with them and even have a sense of a telepathic contact of a different kind. So all of these are possible, but they are on the borderline in the advanced animals. In the human being, though, we come into our own. And so there, he writes, but in man, mind has become separate. He can become aware of his mental operations as distinct from his life operations. So you can say, I'm thinking, I'm not feeling. But there is a stage where you cannot distinguish the two. You actually feel as if your emotions are your thoughts, or your thoughts are your emotions, especially when you're agitated, you're passionate, you're confused. And that's when we behave like animals, or we will say like children. When you see adults upset and quarreling, primarily their thought process is only a form of expression of their passion of emotions. And at that point you'll see irrational behavior. You are wrong. No, it's not like that. No. And it's as if the instinct is, the louder I shout, the more true I will become. And it's illogical if you think of it. But the passion knows itself by domination of power or energy over another, and that's how the animals control each other. And it's as if this value has now imposed itself on the mind. By shouting and pushing harder, I'm going to ram through the truth. But it's not the truth. At least to the mental values, it's not. To the mind, what is needed is stop. Remove the passion. Give me a logical argument. It's a completely different operation. And sometimes you can do that. When a person is passionately confused, you can tell them, okay, let's be quiet and talk like adults. What do you mean by that? Shift to your mind and talk with its values. But you're able to do that. Some are not, and they're still half animal in that sense. His thought and will can disengage themselves from his sensations and impulses, desires and emotional reactions, can become detached from them. Now, Sri Aurobindo gives a series of steps. We could go deep into each of those. When you first separate your thought and your willpower, the first level of separation is from sensation. I am feeling hot, I am feeling uncomfortable, I am feeling pain, and rather than saying, oh, in the pain, I am identified with the emotional distress and the sensational distress, I can stand back, okay, what do I do to stop the bleeding? And so first separation is of sensation. Then the impulse, which is still pushing, I need to do something, you separate and calm and relax from it. And then there's a desire and emotional reaction, which is of a layer above. So literally, step by step, you have to learn to disengage from each of these. In some of the more developed human beings, the capacity to separate from sensations and impulses, even crude desires, is great, but not yet from the emotional reactions. I am upset. You did this, I am very upset. And then I stay wallowing in it, I stay stuck. And the person says, look, I'm sorry. What can we do to fix it? No, I'm sorry. You will have to pay for it. I will not trust you again. You're wallowing in the same emotional condition. I am depressed. I will never forgive you for this. And you're wallowing in. Can you not stop for a moment and say, do I really want to do this? And if, like the dog, you say, what is this? Do I want to live like this? You can instantly separate yourself from the emotional identification. Very few are even interested in doing that because they're so self-satisfied in feeling those emotions, and that itself becomes like a trap. But we have to cultivate this part in particular. Although all those levels are stages of cultivation, this description, sensations, impulses, desires and emotional reactions, should be actually the stages in any educational training in a child or as adults, even to the extent that we're still mixed and embedded in those. But the last part is often the most difficult because we feel ourselves so much in our emotions. But we can disengage from these, and then next step is become detached from them. So disengage is when you're able to stand partly out so that you're no more formed of this. I'm feeling unhappy, I'm feeling betrayed, but now let's move forward and repair. So I'm able to stand back, the emotions have not gone, I've come out of it partly, but then the next step is detached from them. And at that point I can actually feel in my consciousness, I'm no more bound to the emotion. And the moment you're detached, you have a power on the emotions to calm and change them. Okay, I was upset, I'm sorry, here. I take a deep breath, separate, detached, calm my emotions, and now let's move on. And as if nothing has happened. But that power of detachment is when you have the freedom from which you can then observe and control them. Now the observation leads to control, and then sanction or cancel their functioning. Now I can say, yes, I want to accept this or I want to reject this, and I refuse the function of anger or upset. I sanction the function of goodwill, mutuality, or whatever I want to build. But these are all steps, and studying them, observing in oneself where we are, or even formulating these steps as a practice to be able to separate, to attain to this mastery, is part of the knowledge, practical knowledge we would gain from this simple, very simple text. He does not as yet know the secrets of his being well enough to be aware of himself decisively and with certitude as a mental being in a life and body. But he has that impression and can take inwardly that position. So now he is describing something which is not part of normal human life. And if we have not already worked upon it, we don't experience this. The experience of ourselves as a mental being who is living inside a life, energy body and a physical body. Have you ever experienced yourself separate as a mental being? Probably not. And he says, for this, what is required? The secrets of his being. He does not as yet know the secrets of his being well enough to be aware of himself, decisively and with a certitude that you are a mental being. Distinctly you feel, just as you will feel, I have a body, you can even feel, I have emotions, I have a mind. But as a mind, I am a separate being from my emotions and from my body. And not only that, the sense of mind awareness can become so distinct that you know, even if I shed this body, this will continue. That sense, the sense that even this mind is the sense of immortality. At that point you can say, yes, you have become sufficiently separate. But he has that impression, it feels as if, yes, I can stand back. And can take inwardly that position. So somewhere inside us we are able to step back, and as a mental observer you observe your emotions, you observe your sensations and body, and so you have the sense of being separate, but it's not yet a true decisive separation. And this is part of the evolution currently taking place in humanity. Unfortunately, quite a large part of humanity has chosen not to make this effort and has chosen to slide back into a kind of an emotional, sentimental wallowing, which is now being described as a kind of freedom to do what you want, follow your own desires, and anyway there's no point to it, or whatever logical justification you may give to it. But there's a large part that's slipping into that in the name of affirming oneself. And it would be an error. It would be a better step to affirm yourself as a conscious mental awareness than identify with an emotional, sentimental identity and say, this is my affirmation. But well, I suppose it's a passage one would go through that before realizing that there's a higher level of affirmation. But Sri Aurobindo compares these steps of emergence of mind with the emergence of the spirit within us. So too at first, soul in man does not appear as something quite distinct from mind and from mentalized life. Its movements are involved in the mind movement. Its operations seem to be mental and emotional activities. So one example is when you start thinking deeply, and then you begin to feel, no, there has to be a deeper sense of purpose. There has to be something higher, more meaningful. And in your mind, you have the conviction of it. And that's actually a reflection of a spiritual consciousness inside your mind. Or that experience on the top of the mountain is the reflection of the spiritual consciousness, or perhaps even a first emergence of it in the mind. But you still feel it as a mental experience. Or somewhere in the heart you feel spontaneously a quiet joy, deep joy, or a sense of love welling up towards everything or everyone. And so it feels as if my heart, my emotions are feeling it. It's my emotion that flows. Not realizing that it is in fact something deeper which is not emotional, but it's now still heavily mixed with emotions. So it seems as if mental and emotional activities. The mental human being is not aware of a soul in him standing back from the mind and life and body, detaching itself, seeing and controlling and molding their action and formation. Exactly as happened with the mind, you can have this movement of detaching, and from the detached poise, you can actually see your mind, life, body as separate operations that you have, but you are not them. And then from that detached poise, you can actually extend a control and then begin to shape the behavior, shape even the patterns of thought, widen your mind, make it more supple, open it, awaken in it an aspiration, but from a freer poise, which is already having it, which it now brings to the mind. This experience is not there in humanity. It can be developed, we can awaken to it, it's within reach of us, but we have to already begin to make a special effort And since we have never experienced the spirit as separate from mind, we don't know how to begin this. So at first, often it happens you have glimpses of a spiritual insight, awakening, some momentary thing, and then you begin to long for it. You try to get back to it, and then there are these brief moments of separation and living in something deeper or higher, or it feels truer, and then bit by bit there's a slow process. How that process can be done consciously or accelerated will come shortly later. But now he's just going to show you what happens when this separation takes place. So the mental human being is not aware of a soul in him, standing back from the mind, life and body, detaching itself. And so what we often find in many religions is the poise of detachment is taught as a mental experience, and then often that is called your soul. There is a pretty strong popular movement in India, semi-religious you might say, and which involves itself in, they practice Raja Yoga because it is of a largely mental character. They teach practices of concentration or meditation. They focus more on becoming pure, sattvic and so on. But their concept of soul is seat in the center of the head behind the third eye as a center of light. And so their experience is of a mental poise of awareness, standing back from superficial thoughts, standing back to itself as a mental awareness. But they call it soul, they call it spirit, opening to a greater oversoul or cosmic spirit above. Not realizing that it is in fact a poise of mind. In fact, it is a basic position of the intellect when it stands back from its mechanical operations to observe its own thoughts. And so a mental poise sufficiently detached is erroneously identified with the true nature of the detachment, which would be of the soul that stands back from the mind itself as a thing. So it's as if a kind of a reflected experience is often captured, while in the mind or emotions it's captured as, this is the spiritual. Innumerable people, followers of Sri Aurobindo's teaching, having read Psychic Being has this love and devotion, make this common error of identifying their sentimental, sweet emotions as the psychic. So sometimes when I'm in deep concentration or meditation, I feel this deep love, devotion to the Divine Mother or to people. And when I feel this sweet sentimentality, I look at everybody, oh, we are all one family. See, this is my psychic being, it has come forward. Now I've realized my psychic. And in fact, they have declared, there are people here who have declared that and said, I've reached my psychic now, it's over. Now I've moved to something else. There was another man, of course. This is more easy to, not so difficult to distinguish because you're still in an emotional, sentimental space, which is very pure and extremely satisfying to itself, but it's still emotions. It has not stepped out of the emotional and mental complex into a true spiritual consciousness. There used to be another man in the ashram who declared that he had attained to universal consciousness. And what was his way of expressing it? He would stand outside the door of his house. Anybody passing by, he would say, oh, how are you? Pat them on the back and give them a big hug. And he did that with anybody who would become his victim. People began to avoid him. But he thought that was his experience of universal consciousness, because now I'm friendly with everybody. It doesn't matter who you are, what you are, I'm going to hug you. Not realizing, of course, this is a very crude form of self-deception. So it's obvious we can laugh at it. But the other forms are much more difficult to recognize. Until one has decisively an experience of something which is not mind, not emotions, and yet is and more true, more real, more concrete even in reality than these, one cannot know what the spirit is like. And so, that's not part of our normal range. But as the inner evolution proceeds, this is precisely what can, must, and does happen. It is the long delayed but inevitable next step in our evolutionary destiny. this separation of the spiritual consciousness. First of all, not only becoming aware in itself, but standing back from mind, life and body, then detaching itself, then seeing, controlling and molding their action and formation. All these are 4 steps of the spiritual consciousness emerging. This is the inevitable next step. Long delayed. It should have happened long ago. Why long delayed? If you look at the mess that humanity has put itself in over the last, let's say, 100 years. And I say 100 years because 100 years ago, we had not reached the point of ecological collapse. Yes, ecological destruction was there, and a large part of it was the very object of colonization, was to basically go into countries. Any dominant nation would go to a country which it could dominate, subjugate, cut the trees, or take its what they call natural resources, materials, for its industries, for its comforts. So that process had started pretty much, let's say, last few 100 years. But the power of the mind and its knowledge of science has greatly amplified and speeded up this, to a degree that we have now brought the whole earth to collapse. Life itself has got so poisoned, we are on the brink of collapse of life, including our own life. And yet this irrational, desire-driven mind does not stop to say, I'm going to kill myself, and doesn't recognize that it's going to do that. It's thinking in the short term with the passion of the immediate desire. That's the problem. At the very least, if there was a pure emergence of thinking mind, we would say no. We have to plan for the next 1,000 years at least. We cannot make products which will break down in 3 years, because after 300 years there will be no material left to make products. This is logical. It doesn't require spirituality. But with the same logic, we have exercised the power to dominate another. I will survive, or my species or my community or my nation will survive, but that can be destroyed because it is inferior. That was also a logical conclusion, which is not possible when the spirit emerges. So the emergence of the spirit, he says, is long delayed, because if it had emerged, let's say even 100 years ago, we need not have had all these wars and destructions or the collapse of the earth. All those things could have been avoided. But perhaps long delayed is not just 100 years. If we had a larger memory of earth evolution, we would recognize there was a previous cycle of which there is only a vague racial memory. When they speak, for example, of Atlantis, which involved a great destruction that took place, let's say, about 10,000 years ago. That cycle was an attempt to rise into conscious intelligence and even cross intellect to an intuitive mind. It in fact reached an intuitive mental consciousness. Large parts of Earth were covered by intuitively aware humanity. But the passage through the intellect had not been sufficiently developed. It was incomplete in its power of intellect. And so from that intuitive age, there was a collapse, a relapse, because it could not hold its own. It very quickly developed irrational, superstitious is the word we will use today, superstitious formulations of the glimpses it had through the intuitive mind. And it could not correct for its own errors. And so there was a necessity in the evolution for the mind or the evolution or the consciousness to drop back, pass through a harder training of reason, eliminate that power of error, and with the more perfected intellect make a second attempt at the intuition. So long delayed actually points to that greater part of the cycle. If we could have at that point reached to the spiritual, then perhaps all the suffering of the last 10,000 years even could have been avoided. So in a sense, we are behind the requirement of this emergence of spirit, and therefore needlessly delaying. But of course there is a rationale to that drop and the re-emergence, but now there is an urgency as never before. Long delayed, but inevitable next step in our evolutionary destiny. You can try to do everything you can to delay it, but eventually it will fulfill, because the spirit has already decided to push forward. Once it decides, nothing can oppose it. You can delay, you can create complex opposition, distortion to its emergence, but eventually it will overcome all that. That's the nature of the absolute power of the spirit. There can be, the three words he has used. This is precisely what can, must, and does happen. Can, because initially when you're still in the mind, you look forward and you understand why. Yes, it can happen. What must happen, you recognize logically. You've already come to a point where the mind has shifted its balance. You're now in the conviction of it. And then as it begins to emerge, nothing can stop it. And that's the does. There can be a decisive emergence in which the being separates itself from thought and sees itself in an inner silence as the spirit in mind. Or separates itself from the life movements, desires, sensations, kinetic impulses, and is aware of itself as the spirit supporting life. Or separates itself from the body sense and knows itself as a spirit ensouling matter. This is the discovery of ourselves as the Purusha, a mental being or a life soul or a subtle self supporting the body. So this first separation, when the spirit begins to emerge, it often can take this form. A decisive emergence. There can be a decisive emergence. It does not have to be a slow, gradual process. And so this is what many systems of practice, religious and spiritual, aim to realize as a first step. In the practices which are Buddhist, the whole focus is on the mind as your primary agent of liberation. So first you separate out your awareness in the mind, and in the mind you take on a station of observer. And then later you turn upon the mind and extinguish mind to be liberated into the nirvana. But this first step of separating and standing back as a mental witness poise is the object. The same approach you will see in Raja Yoga. Hatha Yoga takes a different approach, which is much more in the physical body. And practices such as Bhakti Yoga will take a similar approach, which is more centered in the emotions. So all three poises of separate observer status, Sri Aurobindo maps out. First, because it is often the most easy for the mental consciousness, it is this which he describes. The being separates itself from thought and sees itself in an inner silence as the spirit in mind. You see, it's not separate from the mental experience, but you've separated from the thoughts. You have activity of thoughts, you stand back and observe. The thoughts come, they go, they rise, they fall. You do not interfere, you simply remain aware. What are you then? Your awareness is a kind of an inner silence. It's not active outside, it is somewhere felt as if inside, but in a silence. Where is this? Inside the mental awareness. Inside mind space, in which the thoughts come, rise and fall. You are in it, but as a silent spirit aware. Excellent poise for a starting point of something deeper. Second, in the same thing in the emotions, or separates itself from the life movements. You're having experiences of emotions, passions, or sensations, impulses, instincts, and as if something inside you separates from them, saying, I'm none of these. And you stand back and become very quiet in the emotions, and in the emotions you experience yourself as a quiet, supporting energy, still. And so he describes it as supporting life, spirit supporting life, not as a mental awareness, but as this emotional standing back. What is interesting is when you ask somebody to stand back from thoughts, many people tend to take a poise in the mind as a mental awareness standing back, but spontaneously many people tend to take this poise which is in the heart, in the emotional center. And it's interesting to notice that they do not have naturally the poise of mind standing back, and it represents a type in humanity. Sri Aurobindo describes broadly 3 categories of the human type. We mentioned this, I think, the last time or the time before. There is the physical man who lives almost identified in the physical body, and then there is the vital man who lives in the passion and drives of his emotions and vitality, and there's the mental man who lives in the mind awareness as their primary identity. When you look at somebody and based on their behavior, you cannot always make out which of these levels they live in, because all 3 may have the same level of intelligence or competence in any life activities. But if you look at what is their priority, then you can make out between the 3. The physical man has priority through the senses. The vital man has priority through impulse and action of impulse. The mental man has priority in the realm of thought and even abstract questions and purpose. The vital man enjoys this. I create, I dominate, I build with logic, with all the intelligence of the mental man. It doesn't mean that the mental man is more intelligent. This fellow can be as intelligent or more, and even more in the practical intelligence of his action. Whereas the other fellow will say, I don't like to dominate and push around. I would rather be quiet and think and analyze and work with people who are like me. We just share thoughts and share experiences. So these are the types who will have abstract thoughts. Again, it's not that they will read books. The vital man also can read books, but his books will involve passion and drama and the domination and conquest. And the physical man will have books which will be of a different category. So that's why the action is not it, but the focus of the action will tell you which of these it is. And the third type, the physical man then, is much more in the body, identified with himself first as body, and separating itself from the body sense, knows itself as a spirit, ensouling matter. And you feel the poise standing back, but it is still primarily in the physical consciousness. And again, I point out, if you tell such a person to stand back from your thoughts, they take a station which is actually a poise in the body consciousness, and are unable to free themselves from the body identification, which is their first I. And one has to be able to notice these 3. Recognize that these are 3 poises common to each type of the three types. And from all 3 you can actually enter into the awareness of spirit or a deeper sense of soul. It's the reason why we have specialized systems of yoga. The Hatha Yoga naturally centers itself on the body and the spirit supporting the body consciousness, as well as many practices even in Buddhism, the practice of the Vipassana, for example, starts with body sensations, separating from them. And while the person doing it may say, I am actually aware as an observer, not recognizing it's not a mental observer, they are in this poise of spirit in body as observer. And somebody else may be mental observer, and they will both use the word observer and mean completely different experiences. And so one has to be very careful what vocabulary you use. You may use the same words, but your meanings may be odd, totally different. Your experiences may have no match. And so distinguishing these 3 is one of the very important requirements if you really want to be able to engage with a person, understand what they are going through, or even help them to move into the next step. So from any of these 3 poises, he says, this is the discovery of ourselves as the Purusha, a mental being or a life soul or a subtle self supporting the body. In all 3, there is a mental component in the awareness, but the poise of focus is distinct. In all 3, there is a refined sense of separation and detachment, as if a reflection of the spirit or of the self. but it has still largely a character of a mental awareness. Your primary poise is of relationship with your nature. You are standing back, but you're not something fundamentally different. You are in it, but as a standing back poise, supporting or observing. So Sri Aurobindo now explains, this is taken by many as a sufficient discovery of the true self, and in a certain sense they are right. For it is the self or the spirit that so represents itself in regard to the activities of nature. But this revelation of its presence is enough to disengage the spiritual element. But self-discovery can go farther. So we need to dwell on this, because this is something so easily accessible and so common. How is this different from the self? So first recognition is, one has the sense of a self or spirit standing back, and people say, yes, this is it. I met in one of the very interesting discussions we had with people from many different traditions sharing something of their experience. And there was a lady, a monk from a Buddhist tradition, a very fine woman, dedicated to her practice now 40 years. And she described, when she goes deep into meditation, she comes into this poise where she stands back, and then everything is quiet and there is no sense of space or time. And then she said, I think this is nirvana. For me, this is nirvana. And that was it. But if she had been under a teacher who had a deeper experience, he would have said, yes, it's an excellent first step, but you must go further for the true nirvana. But she did not have, she was herself like a leader of her community, so for her, but it was good enough, and you don't need more, so why do look for more? There are equally teachers. One such is very famous, I think based in Canada, with books on the importance of the moment of the now. And his whole focus is living in the moment, in the present, not being concerned with future or past or anything outside. You are here in the now, and the power of the now is his focus. And it stops there. It doesn't go beyond that. And it's a poise of the consciousness like this, stepping back. All he has done over the last 20 or 30 years that he has become a famous author and teacher is highlight this. And interestingly, because he moved to the poise of teaching, his further progress stopped. Had he perhaps paused and said, what more? It might have led to further deeper possibilities. But now all the time is taken up by what he has. So there are many like this. You will find teachers who pause, and it feels complete enough. I've met people who have declared themselves enlightened. And how did it happen? One day I woke up, and then suddenly I was enlightened. What did it mean? And if you ask them to describe the state, they will say, well, I was just aware that I am not body, I am not my mind, I am not my thoughts. And so I am free, I am liberated. Of course, they thought this was liberation or this was enlightenment based on some description they had read. And what descriptions? Often of this kind, where the teacher says, you're in the moment, in the now, that's it, you're free. What more do you need? Some of them mixed it with Raman Maharshi's teaching. This is what Maharshi says, you are in the self, so I am in the self, there's nothing happening, nothing to be done. Not realizing this is not self, this is only a poise of the mind, maybe standing back, maybe experiencing a freedom, but it's nowhere near self. At best you can say it's a reflection of the self in the status of mind. So the correct term in the yoga will be Manomaya Purusha, the Purusha or self in the mind or in the quality of mental consciousness. That's all it is. And it is at best a first step for the true self. A similar poise in the vital life energy, standing back, we will say Pranamaya Purusha, the Purusha or self of the nature of prana or in the prana consciousness. And similarly in the physical body, Annamaya Purusha, in the physical consciousness. But any Purusha poise status, feeling itself sufficiently separate as a support, is a step. And so this is what Sri Aurobindo points out. And that's why it feels sufficient, because it's a reflection of the self. It feels like, okay, I don't need more. So, in a sense, in a certain sense, they are right. For it is the self or spirit that so represents itself in regard to the activities of nature. And you see, it exists only in relation to the nature movements of the body, emotions, mind. And this is a poise separating. And this revelation of its presence is enough to disengage the spiritual element. And you can say it stops here, it feels spiritual enough, sufficiently disengaged. And it can become quite deep and quite intense when most complete. You may start with something which is almost superficial as a poise, but it can deepen and stop there. But self-discovery can go farther. It can even put aside all relation to form or action of nature. So far from this poise, you are always aware of nature, you are always aware of form, you are inside nature, you are inside its operations of form. But a further step would mean you separate from these also. And if you do not make that effort to separate, you will never get to that deeper poise. It will just be a deepening of this, an intensifying of this, but remaining stuck in this. For it is seen that these selves are representations of a divine entity to which mind, life and body are only forms and instruments. So in this a more true consciousness, each of these three poises are seen to be only representations of a greater. He uses the word entity, because at this point you don't know what to describe it as. It's not in the mind, it's not in the life, it's not in the body and its sensations. What is it like? And so the first emergence is often kind of a vague, no reference to it. So an entity to which mind, life and body are only forms and instruments. And at that point, we are then the soul looking at nature, knowing all her dynamisms in us, not by mental perceptions and observation, but by an intrinsic consciousness and its direct sense of things and its intimate exact vision. So this whole description now is normally beyond the realm of the common experience. Because even what you had in the mountain top when you experienced that great calm and vastness, or a sense of identification, or even forgot yourself for a while, might have been bordering in the Manomaya Purusha or reflecting in it something of the deeper or higher. That element where you have the sense of I forgot or I lost sense of time is your glimpse through the window of something beyond. And at that point you do not have the registration taking place in the mind. So suddenly there was a gap, I don't remember, an hour has passed, oh I didn't even realize. Because you were momentarily immersed in something outside the registration of your mind or opened to it. And a similar experience from any of these three positions is possible. But at that point, where is the form? Where is nature? They are as if non-existent or forgotten or lost. And then from that poise, you can turn back and recognize nature. But you are not mind. So what is your way of registering nature? So, we are soul looking at nature, knowing all her dynamism in us, in your consciousness now, which is no sense of form, no sense of limit. Nature is as if somewhere inside you, or a part of you, or as if you are intimately inside her, but not in like we experience here, I'm a product of. You feel yourself in as if permeating, but larger than, freer than nature. Knowing all her dynamisms in us, not by mental perception and observation, but by an intrinsic consciousness and its direct sense of things and its intimate exact vision. So intrinsic consciousness means there is an awareness which is not like a mental awareness. It feels something more fundamental. And it is so fundamental that it is almost as if it's there in everything. It is already there. but there is no it, there is only I or it, which is everywhere, in everything. And how does it feel? It feels because it feels itself intimately close to everything from inside out. Even as I am free of it, outside it, embracing it. And when it feels things, when it knows things, it feels it with a vividness which is so much more true, so much more real. Intimate, exact vision. Unlike our mind's vision, which is not intimate first, and second, not exact. What does it mean? You observe a flower, you are a mind observing flower. And all you can observe is its appearance and describing of its appearance. You cannot know what the flower feels. And all the time your mind values are clouded by its preconceptions. Oh, this is a faded flower. Oh, that is small. Look at that. That is big. Oh, this is bright colors. This is more beautiful. These are mental values you have imposed. Rather, the more intrinsic vision is intimate. You feel the flower and as if you feel it as if a part of yourself, or you feel yourself in it, or it is as vividly felt as you feel yourself to be. Intimate from inside. And then an exact vision, because you can feel this little flower is so beautiful, so complete, so true, as much as that flower. And the faded flower has as much value as that bright colored flower. They're different, they're unique, they're complete, so rich in themselves. And so it is a true vision the way the divine would see it. At least you're beginning to approach that. And the direct sense of things, I don't have to stop and think about it. I turn and I know and feel. Able, therefore, by its emergence, as this consciousness begins to dawn in us, able, therefore, by its emergence, to put a close control on our nature and change it. Now, unlike the mental consciousness which turns to the emotions and says, oh, I have emotions and now I have to put my will on my emotions and change them, this consciousness feels itself equally as in the flower, in your emotions, in your thoughts, equally present. And it, because from inside it is a close control. When I choose to quiet myself from there, it's like as if I relax my awareness or choose to will, and all the emotions and thoughts become quiet, effortlessly. So to put a close control on our nature, and from there also to change. The close control is because I'm as if inside the thing and I can just relax. So an analogy, because we need something to understand what this is like, is when in your mind awareness you become conscious of your emotions, and from a poise of complete freedom in mind you can relax the emotions and choose to dissolve the anger that you have. I've got upset and I say I don't want to get upset. What do? You become aware of the emotions of upset. In it, your mind awareness, which is calm and quiet, you infuse and then relax. And just as you would relax your body, you relax your emotions, relax your thoughts, and there you are. But you still had to make an effort, because your mind had to engage with the emotions, permeate, fill the emotions, and will the relaxation into it. Whereas this already is there, and simply choosing, everything begins to settle and fall into place. So the power that the true spirit has on mind, life, and even body is so much greater, because so much more intimate, because it's acting from inside out rather than imposing from outside in. And this is the reason why the more the influence of the spirit can grow in us, whether from within as the psychic seat putting its influence, or from above as the settling presence that fills, the more it fills and takes charge, the more quickly, rapidly, and almost effortlessly it feels as if the changes can begin to take place, and of an even radical change of your personality and nature. He continues this description, what happens when this deeper influence acts. When there is a complete silence in the being, either a stillness of the whole being, or a stillness behind, unaffected by surface movements, then we can become aware of a self, a spiritual substance of our being, an existence exceeding even the soul individuality, spreading itself into universality, surpassing all dependence on any natural form or action, extending itself upward into a transcendence of which the limits are not visible. Now, this is the last step from the earlier poise, where you have this soul looking at nature from a deeper grade of awareness. This can become conscious of a silence, stillness, or it feels the stillness behind supporting. And at that point, as if you're leaning into something which is deep, still, silence, peace, whatever form in which we enter in relation with the self. But for that, the first poise is this requirement of stillness and silence. Now, from what we discussed earlier as the soul looking at nature from this deeper consciousness, this emergence into the true self is relatively easy as a next step. But equally, it is possible to pass into that from your mind consciousness or life or body sensation. You can go directly without needing to pass through this intermediate poise of a soul who is master of nature. You can go straight to self. And again, the method is the same. Complete silence in the being. So you make yourself absolutely still. Your mind becomes completely silent. Your life energies become still. Your senses become quiet. Or a stillness of the whole being may not be complete silence, but stillness deepening. Or even a stillness behind, unaffected by surface movements. So you have activity, but you as if lean back at this sense of a stillness supporting all this. Any of these three would become like a gateway. And as you remain in the stillness, you let all else fade out, and from the depth of that stillness, one begins to feel the true self. And there, all this description now follows. The character of that. And you will see there are many facets to it. The sequence in which Sri Aurobindo describes these facets are often the sequence in which one enters the full experience of self. So first is becoming aware of something, that self. Either within the silence or stillness, filling it as inside the stillness, or supporting behind even the stillness which is at the backdrop of your activities. Behind that is the sense of the self. So first touch of it is a spiritual substance of our being. It has a substantiality, almost it feels like something so dense, so concrete, so much more real as a substance or a presence. And when that begins to settle, it begins as if to invade you, fill you, or surround you, or you feel it around you or within you. It is the first experience as if a tangible contact of the presence. Very often people have this experience. They go into a certain place and then suddenly it's as if a deep peace settles. And you feel as if the peace itself has a tangibility. It is so real, so concrete, living, more dense than what objects that you can touch. And that's your first contact, first glimpse of the substantiality of spirit, spiritual substance of our being. We are that. It is us. That's our reality. As you deepen, an existence exceeding even the soul individuality, where earlier you stood back as the soul in relation to nature, filling, surrounding everything. This is now as if exceeding the individuality and therefore widening out, as if opening out to spreading itself into universality. And at that point there's no sense of boundary, no sense even of limits of the universe. It is greater, larger than all these. And then as you remain immersed in it, a further dimension emerges, surpassing all dependence on any natural form or action. Forms can come and go, actions can come and go. The most violent and the most intense forms and actions could come and go. It is unaffected, it depends on nothing, it is beyond them all. If anything, it originates them or supports and permits their play. So, surpassing all dependence on any natural form or action. And any means including even the whole universe could blow out, fall apart, or rebuild itself anew and go through cycles, but this is unaffected. Such is the depth and vastness and intensity of its freedom. And then a last dimension, extending itself upward into a transcendence of which the limits are not visible. It's often at this point, before this transcendence has taken place, that again it's tempting to stop, because so overwhelming and complete as experience of self that you'll say, I have reached the self, this is it. And you can live in it. You can live detached from the whole world, you can engage in the whole world and still be free in all your engagements, unaffected, undisturbed, and live in this kind of a consciousness, or hold it as the backdrop as you are immersed in activity, and you will say, I have reached the self. And still it is not it. Because there's a further dimension of the self, which is this transcendence. It as if extends beyond, and there's a sense of its extending beyond space, beyond time, beyond anything which could qualify it, even as experience of self. And it is merging into that and taking that to complete transcendence, which would be the fullness of the true experience of self, or its liberation, or its status as transcendent. Having had that, you can then re-embrace these other poises of self, now entering world or embracing world, and then entering and engaging and so on. But the transcendence will be, and there's no description to that because it exceeds all formulation. It is these liberations of the spiritual part in us which are the decisive steps of the spiritual evolution in nature. Now, you can see he has described so many stages. All these will follow, one after another. We could stop at any of them and say, at least for this lifetime, this is great. We can conceive of humanity pausing at any of these stages in its spiritual evolution, and a large part of humanity saying, this is it. There is nothing more, or we don't need anything more. Even as some may continue always at the edge of the further deepening. Of the spiritual part in us, liberations of the spiritual part in us. Who is experiencing this? Not your mind. Because you cannot say mind got into spirit. Mind remains mind. But the spirit within you, which was so far concealed in your mind, or hiding in your emotions, or even in your physical body as a support, it is that part which was hidden, indistinguishable right now, which has separated itself, stood back as the soul supporting and embracing on three levels, and then standing back as an essential soul or self-supporting, and then opening out to its own universal self and its transcendence. It has now not only separated itself, not only come into its own, but fully recovered its true character of spirit. Now you observe, at each of these steps, when it turns back upon mind, life and body, it will be with a far greater power. Not only far greater freedom, but also far greater power. Because the more it deepens into its universality and transcendence particularly, it is at the originating power that bursts out the whole universe. And that power to literally create matter, to create the worlds of mind and life and matter. That power it now engages as it turns not only upon the world, but especially upon your individual mind, life and body. And so what can it do as it turns to your mind? It says, oh, your mind is so narrow. I live in a consciousness which is universal. Can I not make my mind more free and wide and share in my universality? Can I not open my narrow life energies and bring into them the wideness? And maybe even in the physical body, the form of your body is limited, but the consciousness of your body can experience this wide freedom and even experience itself one with the universe. And even its senses, instead of stopping at the first appearance of the color and form of the flower and judging it, the senses can enter into the true perception, or at least approach the true perception the way the self sees and experiences the flower. So when this possibility comes into you now, that's when the true evolution is really taking place. So far it was the spirit emerging to recover its own freedom and assert its spiritual being. But it has not yet taken an evolutionary step in the same way as mind coming into its own must turn upon life and body and reshape them in its terms. So this is what Sri Aurobindo describes now. It is only through these decisive movements that the true character of the evolution becomes evident. For till then there are only preparatory movements. So he's saying very carefully, you have to always stop with nuances of Sri Aurobindo's words and question. He doesn't say it is with these decisive movements that the true character of the spiritual evolution becomes evident. Of course, that is implied because he's talking about the spiritual evolution. But the suggestion is that it is only at this point that you truly understand what this whole evolution was about. Of course, the spiritual evolution, but also the larger evolutionary purpose. Because if you stop at the world as it is now and you say, what a miserable world, what a terrible suffering. And if you follow the conviction which the Buddha had, everywhere you look, you will see only suffering. And you will not find a joy which is pure without the suffering. So you can say suffering is more powerful than the joy because it can assert itself even on the joy. But if you look more deeply, you will find the suffering is only a passage through which the joy is trying to come into its own and has not yet found its mastery and real freedom. And then the whole picture could change. You will not see suffering everywhere. You will see joy everywhere trying to emerge out of incapacity and limitation. And suffering is only passage through which the joy comes out to become truly free and impose itself or its freedom. But it cannot, because the joy is still belonging to a limited power of life energy or mind. But now when the spirit comes out with its full power, it completes what was being attempted by the emotions and thought and can bring the true joy now, and suddenly the suffering is no more of relevance. It is superseded by a greater power for which suffering was a phase of emergence. And now in the big picture you see, yes, this is worth it. Sri Aurobindo reminds us, he says, all this billions of years of struggle and suffering, or darkness and incapacity and all the rest we have been through, billions of years of struggle, all this can be justified only if what has to follow will be so great that even so many billion years of struggle is worth it for it. And that gives you a sense of what this life will be like, what the spiritual manifestation, when it comes into its own and takes full charge and reshapes the universe, what that will be like. It has to be so wonderful that all this suffering is nothing compared to it and totally worth it. And the soul will say, yes, I will go through a billion years of struggle for this. And happily you would enter through that passage. So what can something so wonderful be like? Of course, that is not the immediate discussion, but simply put, the realm of the experience of the Satchidananda, fully manifested in matter, and being able to create therefore a world which is not belonging to the Satchidananda, a world of form, a world in which through limits infinite bliss can pour out and express itself in unendingly infinite diverse variations and possibilities of play. And each form at each moment can reveal the infinity of the Satchidananda of a sheer pure existence, which is utter consciousness, which is utter bliss, and never the same, never repeated. And all these experiences of delight, mingling, joining, filling, creating worlds in forms unendingly. Maybe that is a glimpse of what might be possible. But obviously, that's all the monkey can conceive of the human power of thought, isn't it? And that's how our mind can conceive of the nature of the spiritual creative power. Just as the monkey sees the human being writing, reading, thinking, philosophizing, exploring as a scientist, mastering and enjoying the mastery of these discoveries and discovery of self, of your own consciousness. And the monkey looks at it and cannot quite make out because it's incapable of that experience. But still a glimpse is possible, it feels something. So too we look at this and we feel a glimpse. If the monkey was told, what do you think the next step of evolution will be? Oh, my tail will be so much more powerful that I can jump from one forest to the next forest, from one continent to the next continent. He can only exaggerate his power as the next step. So the mind says, what will the supramental being do? Oh, it will have all the knowledge and act with fantastic power and do whatever he wants. Of course he can do that also, but something fundamentally different. So as one example, an experience like we have of knowledge which the monkey cannot have, an experience that the supramental being will have is the experience of ananda, of bliss, which as an experience is not possible to the mental consciousness because it is living in finiteness and division. And bliss is fundamentally an experience belonging to infinity. So unless you awaken into infinity, you cannot experience even a glimpse of it. But not only it will be a bliss in the spirit, it will then be a bliss now organized and expressed in the mind's experience, in the life energy and prana's experience, and even in the body's experience, and even through its senses. And 5 senses that we have are nothing. Within each of those there will be facets of further perceptions of bliss in different ways, which we have no even possibility except some kind of imagination. You see, when a bird flies across continents for days and nights, you can say it's looking at stars, it's looking at the sun. No, it's sensing the earth. And perhaps we will say it senses the earth's magnetic field. No, it's not just magnetic field, it's sensing its place in the earth somehow, somewhere. And maybe the magnetic field and the sun and the stars are its way of feeling where it is and which direction it has to go. But it has a sense of being somehow in relation to the whole earth. Otherwise it cannot go literally from the northern hemisphere to the southern hemisphere, continuously flying at such a great height where there are no reference points. It feels it. If a bird can do that, a human being should be able to do it. And if a human being can do that, what will the spiritual consciousness experience it as? It will not only feel the whole earth, it will feel earth as a conscious living being. It will feel earth in relation to the whole solar system and the galaxy and the universe. And the whole universe as a conscious living being. And the nature of that conscious awareness will be not your mental awareness, but the bliss, intrinsic, direct, intimate, exact sense and vision of the whole universe in its fullness, where every tiny grain of sand will be visible and aware in your consciousness as vividly as we feel I am conscious. And the delight of each of those particles or grains of sands or whirling galaxies, and not only in the sense of the totality of the universe as a conscious being, but the sense of the totality of the sense of time unfolding, past, present and future included. And in the midst of this totality of its play of bliss, it will concentrate this one focal point that I am in the body and act. A single movement to lift a spoon, to eat food if you want. But the whole universe as if participating in the delight of this. And its enjoyment shared in the whole universe or as if the whole universe is present in this enjoyment. Some sense we have, oh yes, this could be a glimpse of it, and yet it's still the monkey trying to imagine in its higher ranges what the consciousness of mind will be like. So when you look back from this vision of the transcendence of spirit liberated, now living also still in the body by free choice, it is only through these decisive movements that the true character of the evolution becomes evident. Not only in the big picture of evolution, but now in our smaller picture of this spiritual evolution, the emergence of the spirit within us. As these steps come, we say, this is what the spiritual evolution is like. For till then, there are only preparatory movements, a pressure of the psychic entity on the mind, life and body to develop a true soul action, a pressure of the spirit or self for the liberation from the ego, from the surface ignorance, a turning of the mind and life towards some occult reality. 3 directions he is describing, and we will explore this in detail next time. Preliminary experiences, partial formulations of a spiritualized mind, spiritualized life, but no complete change. No probability of an entire unveiling of the soul or self, or a radical transformation of the nature. These are the things which will make it great, but the soul comes fully free, the self comes fully free, nature is radically transformed. That's what we are looking for. But before that, all these are just preliminary, partial, preparatory. And what are those preliminary, partial and preparatory? These are extremely important, because these are our gateways, these are our passage for that full awakening. And so that's why what will follow next, although it seems in relation to this so much smaller, this will be much more important, because this is within our reach, within our access. And not only in terms of effort that we can make, but in terms of help we receive from within, from the psychic being putting its influence on you, the self putting its pressure. That's what he's describing, remember? The pressure of the psychic, the pressure of the spirit for liberation, and the surface ignorance turning towards some inner occult reality. These are the 3 things. But you recognize in the very description, something is already helping from the other side of the veil, but we are unaware. And so if we recognize what is the help of the spirit on us, and then we turn and align to it, although we don't feel it yet, but we align to it, then a kind of connection forms. And through that alignment, we begin to feel it. And through that feeling, it helps us then to enter the true freedom of the experience of the self. So this is going to be the most practical and important, for which first he has given a glimpse of what it is going to lead us to. So we pause here, and we'll continue this next Sunday in dwelling on the description of the emergence of the self. We can concentrate for a while, dwell on the sense of it, and perhaps meditate on it for a while. When there is a complete silence in the being, either a stillness of the whole being or a stillness behind, unaffected by surface movements, then we can become aware of a self, a spiritual substance of our being, an existence exceeding even the soul individuality, spreading itself into universality, surpassing all dependence on any natural form or action, extending itself upward into a transcendence of which the limits are not visible. It is these liberations of the spiritual part in us which are the decisive steps of the spiritual evolution in nature.